In the summer of 1692, 19 people were hanged for crimes no one could prove. The words are simple, cold, but they hang heavy in the air like the damp morning mist that rolls in from the North River. Salem Village, a settlement of hard soil and harder people, was not a place where the extraordinary was welcomed. In the late 17th century, this was Puritan Massachusetts, where survival depended on discipline, order, and the watchful eye of the Lord. It was a world where every action was measured against the Bible, and every misstep was a step toward damnation. The Atlantic wind pressed in from the east, cutting through the rows of timber houses with a chill that seemed to bite deeper than the season should allow. The fields were stubborn and rocky, the crops hard-won. The people who lived here, farmers, labourers, tradesmen, were no strangers to scarcity or toil. They had crossed an ocean for the promise of a godly life, and yet found themselves in a land where the earth resisted the plough and the winters gnawed at bone. By 1692, Salem Village was not a single, united community. It was fractured, split between those who supported the minister, Reverend Samuel Parris, and those who saw him as a divisive force. Old grievances festered beneath the surface: land disputes, inheritance quarrels, church politics. The population was just over 500, but in this small crucible of human tension, grudges carried the weight of years. And then something strange began in the minister's own home. It started with a sound, a soft thud against the wooden floorboards, followed by a muffled gasp. 11-year-old Betty Parris was seen clutching her stomach, bending forward as though struck by some invisible force. The next day, her cousin, Abigail Williams, 12 years old, began to shake not with the shivers of illness, but with violent, jerking movements. Their voices grew wild, spilling into shouts, then collapsing into fits of sobbing. Witnesses claimed the girls would twist their limbs into unnatural positions, crawl under furniture, or stare at the wall with glassy, unblinking eyes. They would cry out words that made no sense, as though speaking in tongues before collapsing in exhaustion. These were not the delicate swoons of fainting ladies. They were the raw, frantic spasms of bodies pushed beyond their control. At first, the household tried to keep it quiet. Illness was common enough in a place where disease travelled swiftly through close quarters. But this was something else. Betty and Abigail could not be soothed with warm broth or scripture readings. The Bible did not calm them. In some cases, the girls seemed to grow worse when verses were read aloud. The minister's wife, Elizabeth Parris, was desperate. A physician was summoned, William Griggs, the only doctor in Salem Village. After examining the girls, he delivered a verdict that would alter the course of history. There was no natural explanation. The cause, he declared, must be supernatural. The words spread like fire in dry grass. Salem was a place where the devil was not a metaphor. He was an ever-present threat, lurking in the wilderness beyond the fields, whispering in the minds of the unguarded. If the minister's own household could be attacked, then no one was safe. By the second week, neighbours began to gather outside the parsonage to see the afflicted girls. They came with curiosity, with fear, and sometimes with an eagerness that spoke of something darker, the thrill of scandal, the secret hope that they might glimpse the devil's work. The girls did not disappoint. Before witnesses, they shrieked, flailed, and accused invisible shapes of pinching them. They covered their ears and screamed at sounds no one else could hear. Some whispered that this was nothing but childish mischief. Others suspected something far more dangerous, witchcraft. And in Salem, in 1692, to be a witch was not a quaint superstition. It was a crime punishable by death. It was not long before the afflicted children began to speak of the shapes they saw in their visions, shapes that took human form, faces they recognized. Salem Village was about to turn its gaze inward, and its first targets would not be strangers. The summer sun rose over fields that had yet to be planted, casting long shadows across the dusty paths. Neighbours crossed themselves when they passed the parsonage. The air felt charged, as though the entire village were holding its breath. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, and someone swore they heard the faint sound of laughter not from a human mouth, but from something else entirely. In a place where the devil was believed to walk unseen, every misfortune, every strange occurrence became a piece of a growing puzzle, and in Salem the pieces were beginning to fit together in the most dangerous way. In the minister's home, Betty Parris convulsed once more and whispered the first name. It began with 2 children and an invisible hand. The small, timber-framed parsonage of Reverend Samuel Parris was never meant to be the center of a storm. It stood on the edge of Salem village, like all the other houses, steep gabled roof, smoke curling from the chimney, walls of weathered wood that creaked in winter winds. But in February of 1692, its rooms would become the stage for a drama that would consume the town. Inside, 2 girls lay at the heart of it: Betty Parris, the minister's daughter, only 11 years old, and her cousin Abigail Williams, 12. Both had been healthy and lively children, quick to help in the kitchen, eager to run in the snow, fond of listening to the minister's sermons with solemn, practiced stillness. But now they moved as though gripped by some unseen force. Witnesses described Betty's first fit as a sudden, unnatural contortion. Her back arched, her limbs stiffened, and her mouth opened in a scream that seemed to rise from deep within her chest. Abigail followed soon after, crying out and thrashing as though fending off invisible attackers. They clutched at their throats, clawed at the air, and convulsed with violent spasms. When the fits ended, the girls were left gasping, their faces pale and damp with sweat. But they found no rest. Within hours, the attacks returned, more violent, more alarming. The girls claimed to see strange shapes in the corners of the room. They shouted about tall, dark figures who whispered to them. They flinched from unseen blows and covered their ears to block out voices no one else could hear. Elizabeth Parris, the minister's wife, did all she could. She tried prayer, warm broth, herbal remedies. She read scripture aloud, but the girls cried out as if the words burned them. A neighbour, Mary Sibley, suggested an old folk remedy, a witch cake baked from rye meal mixed with the afflicted girl's urine, then fed to a dog. The dog was said to react violently in the presence of witchcraft, revealing the source of the evil. The remedy was tried. It brought no relief. By now, word of the strange afflictions had spread beyond the Parris household. Neighbours stopped at the door under the pretense of offering help, but lingered to watch the girls' fits. The Boston Newsletter would later record that they were bitten and pinched by invisible agents, their bodies contorted into strange and unseemly postures. When Dr. William Griggs, Salem Village's only physician, was finally called, he examined the children and found no physical ailment. His diagnosis was chilling. The evil hand is upon them. It was a phrase that carried an unmistakable meaning in Puritan New England. The devil was at work. For the people of Salem, the devil was no abstract idea. They believed he walked in the forests, whispered in dreams, and tempted the faithful away from God. And now, it seemed, he had come into their midst. If Satan's servants could attack the minister's own daughter, then no one was beyond reach. The girls' behavior grew more disturbing. They would collapse, limp as rags, then spring up with unnatural energy. They shrieked that spectral birds pecked at their skin, that ghostly cats prowled around their beds. At times they spoke in low, strange voices that were not their own. The community's fear deepened. In the meeting house, ministers spoke of the devil's schemes, warning that his followers could take any form, even the faces of friends and neighbors. In Salem Village, where grudges simmered and land disputes tore families apart, suspicion had fertile soil in which to grow. As days turned to weeks, more young girls began to exhibit the same symptoms. Anne Putnam Jr., the 12-year-old daughter of one of Salem's most influential families, began to scream during prayers. Mercy Lewis, a teenage servant, claimed to be struck by invisible blows that left her bruised. Mary Walcott, another village girl, started having fits in the middle of household chores, dropping her work to convulse on the floor. The afflicted girls were often found together, feeding off one another's frenzied energy. Their fits became almost theatrical, drawing crowds. When questioned, they spoke of witches, of strange gatherings in the woods, of a devil's book in which names were written in blood, and they claimed that the witches came to them at night, tormenting them in their sleep. Fear gripped Salem. The afflicted were believed, for who would doubt children, especially when they seemed to suffer so greatly? In a society that prized innocence and purity, their accusations carried weight. The adults leaned in, listening closely, desperate for names. The first accusations came quietly, almost hesitantly. The girls spoke of 3 women whose shapes they claimed to see in their fits. One was Sarah Good, a homeless beggar known for her sharp tongue and refusal to attend church regularly. Another was Sarah Osborne, an older woman who had scandalized the village by living with a man outside of marriage and neglecting her religious duties. The third was Tituba, Reverend Paris's enslaved woman brought from the Caribbean, whose foreign customs and storytelling already set her apart. When the names were spoken aloud, something in the village shifted. It was as though a match had been struck in a room filled with dry tinder. These women were already outsiders, living at the edges of the community's trust. Now, they were to be brought forward not as neighbors, but as suspects. It is worth pausing to understand what this meant in Puritan Salem. Accusations of witchcraft were not like accusations of theft or slander. To be called a witch was to be marked for death, unless you could somehow prove your innocence, and even then, survival was rare. The courts allowed spectral evidence, meaning that a witness's dreams and visions could be used to convict you. If someone claimed your spirit attacked them in the night, that could be enough to hang you. In late February, the 3 accused women were arrested and brought before the magistrates for questioning. The trials had not yet begun, but the stage was set. The girls sat in the courtroom, pointing, gasping, crying out as though the accused were tormenting them even there. The magistrates listened gravely. The audience murmured. And at the center of it all were Betty Paris and Abigail Williams, the first afflicted, the sparks that had ignited the fire. Whatever their reasons, whatever truly caused their fits, they had unleashed something that could no longer be contained. The air in Salem felt different now. Doors were bolted at night. Conversations ended abruptly when footsteps approached. The afflicted girls were treated with a mixture of pity and reverence, their every word noted, their visions dissected for clues. No one could have guessed that within months, this small circle of children would set in motion a chain of events that would lead to 20 deaths and the imprisonment of many more. No one, perhaps not even the girls themselves, could imagine the blood that would be spilled because of what began here. And soon, the accusers would step fully into the light, their power growing with each new name they spoke. The next knock on a neighbor's door might not be a friendly visit. By the end of March, the children of Salem were no longer just victims, they were witnesses and arbiters of life and death. The meeting house in Salem Village had always been a place of solemn prayer, where the smell of rough-hewn pine benches mingled with the faint tang of the cold Atlantic winds seeping through the walls. But now it was something else, a stage. Inside, the afflicted girls sat together in a tight cluster, wrapped in shawls, pale and trembling. Their eyes darted toward the accused with visible terror, or something that looked like terror. Every gasp, every cry, every sudden contortion of the body was watched by the entire town. When Betty Paris and Abigail Williams first began to speak in their fits, the words had been vague, shadowy figures, dark shapes, claws, and whispers. But now, their voices grew sharper, more deliberate. They named names with precision, their voices carrying across the packed room. Sarah Good, Sarah Osborne, Tituba. These names had already been spoken, but soon new names emerged, and with each one, the walls of safety in Salem seemed to close in. The girls described visions that made the audience murmur and lean forward. They told of seeing the accused women's specters climbing into their beds at night, of ghostly claws scratching their skin, of whispers in their ears, urging them to sign the devil's book. Sometimes they claimed the specters appeared as animals, a black cat, a yellow bird, even a wolf shadow slipping along the floorboards. The more the girls spoke, the more their stories seemed to feed one another. Ann Putnam Jr., Mercy Lewis, and Mary Walcott began to outmatch even Betty and Abigail in the vividness of their accounts. Anne claimed that she had been choked in her sleep by invisible hands. Mercy swore she had been pricked by a witch's needle. Mary said she had seen the devil himself, wearing a tall black hat, standing behind Sarah Good as she mended her clothes. And when they spoke in the courtroom, the accused were expected to answer, but every protest seemed to backfire. Sarah Good, known for her sharp tongue, argued loudly with the magistrates. Her defiance was taken as proof of guilt. Sarah Osborne, ill and frail, could barely speak in her own defence. Her silence was seen as sinister, and Tituba broke the pattern entirely. When questioned, Tituba confessed, but it was a confession woven from the fabric of the girl's own nightmares. She spoke of the devil's book, of strange beasts that served him, of flying through the air on dark nights. She even named others she claimed to have seen at these gatherings, a move that widened the circle of suspicion. It was part confession, part accusation, and it electrified the room. In Puritan New England, a confession was a powerful thing. It was not a shield from punishment. Witches, even repentant ones, could still hang, but it confirmed to the people that the devil's servants were indeed among them, and that the threat was as real as their own shadows. Tituba's words poured fuel on the fire. The effect on Salem was immediate. Suddenly, to be accused was to stand at the edge of the grave. Neighbors began to eye one another warily. A harsh word exchanged over a fence line last year could now return as a whispered accusation. Old grudges over land boundaries, inheritance, or church disputes found a new and deadly outlet. The girls, whether they understood the full weight of their power or not, had become central figures in this new order. People sought them out, not to comfort them, but to listen, to ask questions, to search their faces for signs. Were they pale because of illness, or because another witch had visited them in the night? Every flinch, every shudder, was interpreted as a message from the unseen world. In the courtroom, the transformation of the girls into performers was complete. When an accused person entered, the afflicted would sometimes fall into immediate fits, clutching their throats, collapsing to the floor, or screaming that they were being pinched. Magistrates took these as signs that the accused's spirit was present and tormenting them. On one occasion, the court was examining a woman named Martha Corey. She had been a respected member of the church, the kind of person no one would have dared accuse only months earlier. But when the girls began their fits, rolling their eyes and twisting their limbs, the room turned against her. Even her steady voice, calmly denying every charge, sounded hollow in the face of the girl's wild convulsions. It was theatre, but theatre with fatal stakes. The people of Salem did not see performance. They saw spiritual warfare, and the girls had become its prophets. The accusations began to move beyond Salem village. People from neighboring communities like Ipswich and Andover found themselves named. The web was growing wider, and the logic behind it thinner. There was no clear pattern to who might be accused. A beggar could be named in the same breath as a wealthy landowner. A young woman might be called out one day, and her respected father the next. Behind it all was a deep, unspoken truth. Once the wheel of accusation began to turn, it was almost impossible to stop. To speak out against the trials was to risk being accused yourself. To defend the accused was to invite suspicion, and so the girls' words held the weight of the gallows. When they pointed, people listened. When they screamed, people believed. And when they fell silent, the air in the room felt heavy, as if everyone was waiting for the next name to drop. By April, the list of the accused had grown so long that the jail in Salem could no longer hold them all. Prisoners were moved to Boston and Ipswich, chained in damp cells, waiting for trials that might never come. Some would die there without ever standing before a judge. But for the afflicted girls, there was no slowing down. They had tasted the strange power that came with their visions. Whether born of fear, suggestion, or something darker, their fits now shaped the fate of an entire community. And the people of Salem, they kept watching, kept listening, kept whispering. The town had become a place where a glance could kill, where a dream could condemn, where a child's word could end a life. The next step in the trials would shatter the last illusions of safety. For soon, the first truly public accusations would name not just the outsiders, but the heart of Salem's own congregation. And when the girls spoke those names, there would be no turning back. It began with 3 names, 3 women who could not have been more different, yet, in the minds of Salem, they were bound by the same invisible rope. The meeting house was packed that late winter morning. The air smelled of damp wool cloaks, unwashed skin, and the faint smoke from the hearth that barely warmed the room. The magistrates sat at a long wooden table, their black cloaks heavy across their shoulders, their quills scratching faintly against parchment, and before them, trembling, sweating, eyes wide, sat the afflicted girls. When the first question was asked, "Who afflicts you?" there was silence. The crowd leaned in. Outside, the wind rattled the bare branches against the windows, and then, almost in unison, the names came: Sarah Good, Sarah Osborne, Tituba. The words hung in the air like frost, and in that moment something shifted in Salem. The spell, whether born of hysteria, fear, or something darker, had been cast. Sarah Good was the easiest to hate, a beggar woman in her late 30s, her face lined from hardship, her clothes ragged and smelling of the road. She wandered from house to house with her pipe clenched between her teeth, muttering to herself. If someone refused her bread, she was known to curse under her breath. In a town as steeped in superstition as Salem, those mutters were remembered now with icy clarity. Neighbors whispered of a time she had spat at a child's feet, of how livestock sometimes sickened after she had passed by. None of these things had mattered enough to bring her before a magistrate until now. Sarah Osborne was another matter. She was older, frail, and ill, rarely seen in public. Once married into a respected family, she had scandalized Salem years earlier by refusing to raise her stepchildren's inheritance properly, and by living with her servant before marrying him. In Puritan eyes, this was sin enough to tarnish her soul. That she had been absent from church for nearly 3 years only confirmed suspicions that she walked apart from God. And then there was Tituba, the enslaved woman in Reverend Samuel Parris's own household. She was of Caribbean origin, her skin dark, her voice marked with a lilting accent that made her both fascinating and foreign to the Puritans. The village children loved her stories, tales of strange animals, magic, and spirits from faraway lands. But now, those same stories were being retold in court as dangerous knowledge. The girls claimed she had shown them how to use eggs to divine the future, how to listen for spirits in the wind. In Salem's rigid world, such acts were perilously close to witchcraft. The accusations were not shouted, they were spoken with trembling conviction, as if each girl feared the spectres of these women might be in the room, watching. The magistrates pressed for more details, and the stories came. Sarah Good's spirit pinching them in the night. Sarah Osborne's spectre sitting on their chests so they could not breathe. Tituba's shadow whispering to them in the meeting house. The accused were brought forward one by one. Sarah Good stood defiant, her chin raised despite the dirt on her clothes. She denied everything, but her sharp replies drew frowns from the magistrates. When she could not recite the Lord's Prayer perfectly under pressure, murmurs rippled through the crowd, for in Puritan belief, a witch could not speak holy words without faltering. Sarah Osborne, weakened from illness, could barely hold herself upright. She denied the charges in a faint voice, but her absence from church for years was spoken of as if it were proof. In this world, neglect of the Sabbath was as suspicious as a midnight meeting with the devil. Tituba, however, was different. She looked from the girls to the magistrates, then lowered her eyes. When she finally spoke, her words were slow, deliberate. She admitted she had been approached by the devil. She admitted she had seen a great black dog, a hog, and a red cat. She admitted she had been asked to serve evil. But she did not claim to have done harm willingly. Instead, she said she had been forced, threatened. And then she named others, shadowy figures she claimed to have seen in the devil's company. It was the perfect spark for Salem's growing fire. Tituba's confession gave weight to the girls' accusations and expanded the web of suspicion beyond the 3 women before the court. The magistrates leaned forward as she spoke, their quills scratching faster. Every new detail, the devil's book, signed in blood, the gatherings in the woods, the shapes of beasts painted a vivid, terrifying picture for a town already teetering on the edge of panic. By the end of that day, the three women were committed to jail in Boston to await further examination. Chains clinked at their ankles as they were led away, the iron biting into their skin. Outside, the wind had shifted, colder now, and the crowd followed them with eyes that no longer saw neighbors but enemies of God. Salem had taken its first step into a darkness from which it would not easily return. The moment those names were spoken, the rules of life in the village had changed. Friendship, kinship, and reputation were no longer shields. All that mattered now was who might be accused next, and the next names would cut deeper, striking at the very heart of the church and the families that believed themselves untouchable. For in Salem, no one, not even the righteous, would be spared. Confession in Salem was not the end of fear. It was the beginning of something far worse. The room was heavy with the smell of damp wood and bodies pressed too close. Outside, the March wind howled along the frozen river, but inside the meeting house, the air was stifling. The magistrates sat in their high-backed chairs, faces carved from stone, their eyes fixed on the woman standing before them. Tituba's wrists were bound with coarse rope, the fibers biting into her skin. She had been pulled from the Reverend Paris household in the early morning hours, roused from uneasy sleep, and marched through the snow to this place. She had known this moment was coming. The whispers had grown for weeks. The girl's accusations, the strange fits, the sideways glances in the village lane all pointed to her. She was the outsider in every way that mattered. Her skin a deep brown in a sea of pale faces, her speech marked by the rhythms of the Caribbean, her knowledge of stories and charms, unlike anything the Puritans understood. She had seen the way Salem looked at her when she spoke of spirits and omens. What had once been idle entertainment for children was now proof, in the eyes of the fearful, that she walked with the devil. The questioning began softly, almost gently, but with an undercurrent of danger. "Tituba," one magistrate began, leaning forward, "are you in league with the devil?" She hesitated. In the long pause, the only sound was the faint creak of the building in the wind. Then she lowered her gaze. "Yes," she whispered. A murmur ran through the crowd. Someone gasped. "What did he bid you do?" The words came slowly, haltingly, as if she was pulling them from a place she had long tried to bury. "He bade me serve him. He bade me hurt the children." Her voice trembled. "But I did not wish it. He said he would kill me if I refused." The magistrates exchanged quick glances. They pressed for more. Who was he? What form did he take? Tituba's eyes lifted slightly, and she began to weave her confession, a strange, terrible tapestry of beasts, shadows, and forbidden gatherings. She spoke of a great black dog that followed her in the night, of a hog with eyes like embers, of a yellow bird that perched on her shoulder and whispered secrets. She told of a tall man in dark clothing who carried a great book in which she was made to sign her name in blood. As she spoke, the room seemed to shrink. People leaned in, their eyes wide, their faces pale. Even the most skeptical were drawn into the spell of her words. She was no longer just a servant. She was a witness to a hidden world, a world where the devil himself walked among them. And then she gave them what they truly wanted, other names. She spoke of women she had seen at the devil's meetings, of shapes she could not always recognize, but sometimes matched the faces of Salem's own. She described gatherings in the woods under a cold moon, where voices chanted in languages she did not know, where bread and drink were passed that burned the tongue like fire. She spoke of laughter that sounded like crying, of children's shadows flitting in the trees. Every detail was written down, every word was fuel. The afflicted girls, sitting together in the front, began to writhe and cry out as she spoke, claiming they could see the spectres of those named standing in the room. One shrieked that Sarah Good's shadow was clawing at her. Another pointed at an empty corner and screamed of a black shape crouched there. For the magistrates, it was proof upon proof. Tituba was confessing, the girls were reacting, and the devil's network in Salem was beginning to take form on their parchment. But what no one said aloud, at least not yet, was that Tituba's confession had done something far more dangerous than condemn herself. She had shifted the game. By naming others, she had planted suspicion like a seed in the frozen soil of Salem. That seed would grow with terrifying speed. The questioning went on for hours. At times Tituba's voice was steady, at others it faltered, as if she feared the very things she described might appear before her. She spoke of spectral cats, of women flying through the air, of cold hands pressing against her chest as she slept. She spoke of the devil's promise of freedom and fine clothes, and how she had refused but been punished all the same. When at last she was led away, her face glistened with sweat, her steps heavy in the iron shackles. She had given Salem the devil's presence in living colour, and the magistrates would not turn away from it now. Outside, the crowd buzzed with her words. They repeated them in fragments. The black dog, the red cat, the devil's book. They would carry those fragments back to their homes, turn them over in their minds, and begin to wonder about their own neighbours, about the woman who never looked them in the eye, about the man whose fields always seemed to thrive when others failed. Fear had been a shadow in Salem before. Now it was flesh and bone, and in the days that followed, the accusations would leap from the poor and the outcast to the very heart of Salem's respected families. Because Tituba had spoken and Salem had listened, fear in Salem was no longer content to lurk in the shadows. It began knocking on every door. In the cold spring of 1692, the streets of Salem were restless. A wind from the harbour rattled loose shutters, carrying with it the scent of salt and wood smoke. But beneath the ordinary rhythms of life, the hammering of a cooper's mallet, the creak of wagon wheels, something invisible had taken root. It moved from house to house, not as a whisper, but as a certainty. The devil's hand was here, and no one was beyond his reach. Tituba's confession had opened a door no one could close. In its first days, the accusations had clung to the edges of society, touching only those already looked down upon: the homeless beggar Sarah Good, the reclusive and sickly Sarah Osborne, the enslaved woman whose skin and speech set her apart. The respectable folk of Salem could tell themselves it was a problem for other families. But that comfort lasted only a few weeks. In the dim light of the meeting house, new names began to appear on the magistrates' lips, names that did not belong to outcasts. It began with Martha Corey. She was no stranger to the meeting house pews. A member of the church, a woman who dressed plainly, prayed regularly, and had never been known to break the rigid codes of Puritan behaviour. But when one of the afflicted girls cried out that Corey's spectre was tormenting her, suspicion was planted like a burr under a saddle. When Martha appeared before the court, she carried herself with the dignity of someone who believed the truth would protect her. "We must not believe all these lying wonders," she told the magistrates. But the very act of doubting the afflicted was dangerous. Her skepticism was seen not as reason, but as proof that the devil had blinded her to her own sins. The girls convulsed in the gallery, shrieking that Corey's spirit was upon them, even as she stood silent before the judges. Spectral evidence, the claim that one could see a person's spirit acting apart from their body, was enough. It did not matter that such visions were invisible to anyone else. In Salem, invisible things could kill you. Soon after, Rebecca Nurse's name was spoken. She was 71 years old, frail and pious, a pillar of the community. When her arrest warrant was read, there was an audible intake of breath among the villagers. If Rebecca could be accused, who could possibly be safe? The answer was chilling: no one. By late March, the pace quickened. The afflicted began pointing to merchants, landowners, even relatives of the magistrates. Elizabeth Proctor, wife of the outspoken farmer John Proctor, was accused after a servant claimed she sent her spectre to pinch and choke her. The Proctors were not loved by all. John had been critical of the trials, but they were not the sort of people one expected to see in chains. And yet, in Salem's charged air, even a frown could be fatal. The courts, sensing the fever of the crowd, leaned into it. Each new accusation was not met with disbelief, but with an eager readiness to believe. It was as if the village had decided that the only way to cleanse itself was to keep digging until every root of evil was torn from the soil, no matter how deep they had to go. Old grudges began to surface in convenient ways. A boundary dispute from years past might suddenly turn into an accusation of spectral trespass. A cow that sickened could be laid at the feet of a neighbour's supposed witchcraft. The trials became not only a hunt for the devil's servants, but a weapon in the hands of the spiteful and the ambitious. By April, jails in Salem and surrounding towns were filling. The prisoners ranged from the destitute to those who had once sat in judgment over others. Shackled together in cold, damp cells, they listened to the muffled sounds of life continuing outside the calls of hawkers in the street, the creak of cartwheels, knowing that each day might bring the rope closer. In the meeting house, the afflicted performed with an energy that seemed inexhaustible. They shrieked, they contorted, they cried out invisible wounds. To question them was to risk becoming their next target. Some began to suspect that the only path to safety was to join the chorus of belief. The spiral tightened. Wives accused husbands. Children accused parents. Long-time friends stood in court to give damning testimony. A farmer might point to a neighbour's ill luck and see not misfortune, but malice. And each new story added another layer to the sprawling, invisible map of evil the magistrates were convinced they were uncovering. Salem had become a place where truth no longer mattered. Reputation could not save you, silence could condemn you, and a single pointed finger could change the course of your life in an instant. By early May, the number of accused had grown so large that Massachusetts decided a formal mechanism was needed. A special court, the Court of Oyer and Terminer, would be established to hear the mounting cases. The colony's leaders believed this would bring order to the chaos. Instead, it would give the hysteria a new, official stage. The afflicted, emboldened by their role, now found themselves at the center of Salem's daily life. Their visions determined who was dragged from their bed at dawn, whose livestock was seized, whose home was left to decay. They were teenagers and young women, with power no Puritan minister could have imagined, and in Salem's strange new world, they were untouchable. Neighbours no longer met each other's eyes in the street. Church pews that had once been filled with murmured prayers now held pockets of empty space, as the missing sat in jail or waited in fear at home. Even the ministers, who had once urged their flocks to stand against the devil, began to worry privately that the devil's greatest victory was turning Salem against itself. But no one dared say so aloud. Not yet. For by this time, the gallows had been built, and in just a few weeks they would be put to use. And in the special court that awaited them, there would be no shortage of rope or willing hands to pull it. When fear has a judge and panic has a gavel, the verdict is never in doubt. By May of 1692, the jail cells of Salem and its neighbouring towns were swollen with the accused. Farmers, merchants, widows, servants, each chained in the same damp darkness, each waiting to learn whether they would walk free or hang from the gallows. The chaos had become too large for the small local hearings to handle, so Massachusetts Governor Sir William Phips proclaimed the creation of a special tribunal, the Court of Oyer and Terminer. Its name was French to hear and determine, and its purpose was simple. It would hear the accusations of witchcraft, determine guilt, and hand down sentences. But this was not a court in the modern sense. It was not a place where the accused could expect protection under the law. In Salem's court, the burden of proof was inverted. Innocence had to be proved, not guilt. And with the devil himself imagined as the enemy, how could anyone truly prove they had never signed his book or danced in his circle? The panel was made up of some of the most prominent men in the colony: Chief Justice William Stoughton, a man whose stern faith saw no room for doubt; Samuel Sewell, a respected merchant; John Richards, a devout magistrate. Their robes carried the weight of the law, but their minds were steeped in the same Puritan fear that had infected the streets. When the first session opened in June, the courtroom was packed. Villagers filled the benches and crowded at the windows, their breath clouding the glass. This was not merely a legal proceeding. It was a theatre of salvation and damnation. The accused were paraded before the judges, their wrists bound, their faces pale from weeks in the cold jail. One of the court's most controversial tools was the acceptance of spectral evidence. If an afflicted girl claimed she saw the ghostly shape of the accused tormenting her, pinching, choking, or whispering in her ear that alone could be enough to convict. There was no way to disprove it. The accused could insist they had been in their bed all night, surrounded by witnesses, but the court believed the devil could take their form without their consent. And so, absence from the scene meant nothing. In this way, truth became slippery. Dreams, visions, and invisible assaults weighed as heavily as tangible proof. The afflicted would collapse in fits on the courtroom floor, their eyes wide with terror, screaming that the accused's spectre stood over them. Judges leaned forward, watching intently, as if these unseen dramas were as real as the wooden benches and the nails in the floorboards. The first to be tried before the new court was Bridget Bishop, a woman known for wearing bright clothes and speaking her mind. She was already the subject of gossip long before the trials. Witnesses claimed she bewitched pigs until they died, enchanted cider barrels, and sent her spectre to choke children in their sleep. Bishop denied everything, but the testimony against her, both visible and spectral, was overwhelming in the eyes of the judges. On June 10th, Bridget Bishop was hanged. Her death was swift, but the message was clear. The gallows were open for business. After Bishop, the court moved quickly. In the humid heat of the summer, case after case was heard. The afflicted wailed. Neighbors testified against neighbors. Ministers spoke of the devil's presence in the colony. Every conviction fed the belief that the court was doing God's work, that each body swinging from the gallows was another victory over hell itself. The accused tried every defense they could muster. Some prayed aloud in the courtroom, hoping their piety would sway the judges. Others pointed out the absurdity of spectral evidence, only to be met with suspicion. A few confessed outright, thinking it might spare their lives, and in some cases it did. Confession was seen as repentance. Those who denied to the end, however, were seen as stubborn servants of Satan, refusing to relinquish their master. The court's pace was relentless. By July, Rebecca Nurse, the frail 71-year-old matriarch, was brought before the tribunal. Her case rattled even some of the faithful. The idea that a woman so devoted to her church could be in league with the devil seemed absurd. But when the afflicted cried out against her, and when one of her own family members gave hesitant testimony, the verdict was sealed. Nurse was condemned and hanged alongside others on July 19th. John Proctor, a farmer with a sharp tongue, fared no better. His outspoken criticism of the trials had made him an enemy in the eyes of the court. His wife, Elizabeth, was pregnant, which delayed her execution, but John himself was not spared. Witness after witness, including some of the afflicted, claimed his spectre tormented them. Proctor's protestations of innocence fell on deaf ears. The court, in its grim efficiency, had become a machine. It did not question its own righteousness. Each execution was followed by prayer, each noose sanctified by belief. And the gallows on Proctor's Ledge became a place of regular pilgrimage, not for mourning, but for public warning. Still, the number of accused grew. By August, more than 100 people sat in jails across Essex County, awaiting trial. Some were chained to the walls to prevent their spectres from flying free. The stench of sickness and fear hung heavy in the cells. Food was scarce, water was brackish, and always the sound of distant hammering carpenters strengthening the gallows for the next round. Not all of the colony's leaders were comfortable with what they saw. A few ministers, including Increase Mather, began to speak cautiously against the reliance on spectral evidence, but their words were quiet in a town that roared for more names, more arrests, more hangings. Outside the courthouse, life in Salem had grown hollow. Fields went untended. Trade slowed. Families were torn apart, some by the rope, others by the suspicion that anyone, even kin, could be next. And in the humid nights, the cries of the accused from their cells drifted down the narrow streets, unsettling even those who claimed to welcome the trials. The court of Oyer and Terminer would run through the summer into the autumn. By the time its work was done, it would have condemned 19 people to hang, pressed one to death, and left many others to rot in prison. And yet, in August, when the noose tightened around the necks of 5 more, including Reverend George Burroughs, a former Salem minister, there were murmurs in the crowd. Burroughs had recited the Lord's Prayer flawlessly from the gallows, something believed impossible for a witch. For the first time, doubt cracked the surface of certainty, but the court was not yet finished. The machinery of accusation and execution was still in motion, and before it ground to a halt, it would claim some of the most respected names in Salem. Next came the days when the gallows were never cold, and the air was thick with the silence that followed each drop. When the first rope tightens, it is not just a neck that breaks, it is the breath of a whole town. June 10th, 1692. The sun rose pale over Salem. Its light filtered through a veil of mist from the nearby marshes. By mid-morning, the mist had burned away, leaving the day sharp and unforgiving. It was the kind of day where shadows seemed to cling to people, and the air carried the taste of iron. That morning, Bridget Bishop was led from the jail to the place that had been chosen for execution, a rocky slope outside town, later called Proctor's Ledge. She was the first to be condemned under the authority of the Court of Oyer and Termina, and the first to die for the crime of witchcraft in Salem. Bishop's walk to the gallows was watched by dozens. Some came out of fear, others from a grim fascination. Parents brought their children to see justice done, hoping the sight would frighten them into obedience. Ministers walked ahead of her, murmuring psalms, their voices trembling between duty and unease. Bridget herself was dressed plainly gone, with the bright red bodices and ribbons that had made her a target of gossip for years. Her wrists were bound, the rope biting into her skin. She moved with a strange composure, though her face betrayed moments of strain, as if she knew every step was another she could never take back. When they reached the gallows, the crowd fell into a hush that seemed to make the birdsong fade. The structure was simple: 2 upright beams, a crossbar, and a single rope swaying in the breeze. The sheriff read her sentence. There was no weeping from the officials, no hesitation. Asked for her final words, Bishop again declared her innocence. She had never signed the devil's book, never sent her spirit to torment anyone, but her words hung in the air without purchase. The hangman tightened the noose. A psalm was sung, and then the drop. It was not clean. The rope was rough hemp, and the fall was short. There was a shudder, a tightening, a stillness. The crowd shifted on their feet. A few turned away. When her body was cut down, it was carried not to consecrated ground, but to a shallow grave near the ledge, as if even the earth of Salem had to be guarded from her. If anyone thought this first execution might cool the town's fever, they were wrong. The weeks that followed saw more trials, more convictions, and more marches to the gallows. By July, 5 more names were added to the list: Sarah Good, Sarah Wilds, Elizabeth Howe, Susanna Martin, and Rebecca Nurse. Rebecca Nurse's execution shook many. She was 71 years old, frail, and beloved by her congregation. For years, she had been the image of piety in Salem village. Even the governor's wife had doubts about her guilt, but doubts were drowned out by the cries of the afflicted and the determination of the court. On the morning of July 19th, the 5 women were driven by cart to Proctor's Ledge. The summer sun beat down on them, heat shimmering off the stones. Sarah Good's face was set in a defiant scowl. Rebecca Nurse's was pale and still, her lips moving silently in prayer. Elizabeth Howe and Susanna Martin exchanged whispered words, and Sarah Wilds kept her eyes fixed on the horizon, as though she might yet walk toward it. Before the ropes were placed, Sarah Good turned to the Reverend, who urged her to confess and save her soul. Her reply cut through the air: "You are a liar. I am no more a witch than you are a wizard, and if you take my life, God will give you blood to drink." Her voice carried, and some later swore the minister paled at her words. The nooses were fitted, the beams creaked, 5 bodies fell in unison, the crowd exhaled. The ropes swayed in the hot air, like pendulums marking the hours of Salem's madness. In August, the gallows took another 5, including John Proctor, the farmer who had dared to speak against the trials, and Reverend George Burroughs, a former minister of Salem. Burroughs's execution would be remembered for the unease it caused. Moments before his death, he stood on the gallows and recited the Lord's Prayer perfectly, without falter. This, according to Puritan belief, was impossible for a witch. The devil would not allow it. Murmurs rose from the crowd. Doubt began to seep into some hearts. But Chief Justice Stoughton dismissed it. The drop came. The prayer ended in silence. John Proctor died that same day, his body swinging beside Burroughs. His wife, Elizabeth, spared only because she carried his unborn child, remained in jail, awaiting her own uncertain fate. By September, the executions had become almost routine. The cart to the gallows rolled along the same path, the same dust rising from the wheels, the same murmurs from the crowd. 4 more were hanged on September 22, among them Martha Corey, once a respected church member, and Mary Easty, sister to Rebecca Nurse. Mary Easty's final words were written down, a plea not for her own life but for an end to the trials. "I petition to your honours not for my own life, for I know I must die, but to beg you to stop these proceedings, for the innocent are dying." Her words fell like stones into a well deep, resonant, and quickly swallowed. On the gallows that day, the air was heavy, the sky overcast. As the nooses tightened, the first cool winds of autumn began to creep through Salem. The crowds were smaller now. The novelty had worn thin, but the machinery of the court still turned, and the ropes still swung. By the time the last execution of September ended, 19 people had been hanged. One, Giles Corey, had been pressed to death under stones. Dozens still languished in fetid cells, awaiting trial. Families were broken, land lay fallow, and Salem, though outwardly righteous, was beginning to feel the first tremors of doubt. The gallows themselves stood silent between executions, the wood darkened by weather and use. Some swore the ledge was cursed now, that no grass would grow where the bodies had fallen. Children avoided it. But the court's work was not done. More accusations waited. More trials were scheduled, and soon the net would widen, pulling in those Salem had once thought untouchable. Chapter 9. The net widens. The noose has a way of growing, until it fits the necks no one thought it would touch. By late July 1692, Salem's gallows had already claimed the lives of the poor, the marginalized, and the inconvenient. Beggars, widows, the eccentric, and the disliked, these were easy prey for the court's appetite. But hysteria is a fire without borders, and soon it began to consume those who had once stood firmly in the town's circle of respectability. The first shock came when Rebecca Nurse, executed only weeks earlier, left Salem's conscience raw. She had been one of their own, a woman of prayer, a matriarch. If she could hang, then no one was safe. Still, the court pressed on, and the accused grew ever more prominent. By August, names began to appear in the indictments that made even the most ardent believers in the trials falter. Martha Corey was one of them. She was a respected, God-fearing woman, married to Giles Corey, a landowner and church member in good standing. For years, Martha had openly doubted the legitimacy of the witchcraft accusations, suggesting that the girl's fits were nothing but pretense. In Salem, skepticism had become a dangerous sport. When Martha herself was accused, the courtroom bristled with tension. The afflicted girls writhed on the floor, claiming her spectre pinched and choked them. She stood firm, her voice calm, denying the charges with a clarity that only seemed to inflame the judges. To them, her composure was proof of the devil's steadying hand. The reach of the net did not stop there. John Proctor, a man known for his blunt honesty and sturdy independence, was next. Proctor had been one of the most outspoken critics of the trials, calling the court a sham and the afflicted girls liars. When his own wife Elizabeth was accused, Proctor saw the writing on the wall. He pleaded with friends in Boston to intervene, even petitioned for the trials to be moved elsewhere. His efforts only sealed his fate. It was said that in Salem, defending the accused was as good as confessing yourself. Soon, the accusations spread to the rest of his family, his son, his daughter-in-law, even his servants. By the time August reached its sweltering peak, the Proctor name was as tainted as any in the village. Others followed. George Jacobs Sr., a stooped, elderly farmer, Francis Nurse, brother-in-law to Rebecca, who had tried to rally support for her innocence, and even men of the cloth, like Reverend George Burroughs, once the minister of Salem Village itself. Burroughs' case sent a shiver through Massachusetts. He had enemies. To be sure, his strict, almost military discipline had made him unpopular in Salem years earlier, but the idea that a man who had led them in prayer could also serve Satan's will was too much for some to stomach. Yet the court seemed hungry for his fall. The accusations swelled with each passing day. Land disputes, family rivalries, and old grudges slipped quietly into the legal record, dressed in the language of spectral attacks and demonic pacts. One neighbor might remember a long-forgotten insult. Another might suddenly recall a cow's mysterious death, all now interpreted as evidence of witchcraft. The more prominent the accused became, the more it seemed the trials were no longer about rooting out witches, but about reshaping the power of the town. Land once owned by the condemned could be seized. Influence could shift. In Salem, piety and greed walked hand in hand. By early September, the jail was swollen beyond capacity. Chains clinked in the dim light, the air thick with sweat, rot, and despair. Among the prisoners were some of Salem's wealthiest landowners and most devout parishioners. It was a bitter irony. Those who had built the town's foundations now lay on its stone floors, awaiting a rope. In the marketplace, whispers spread like smoke. If Rebecca Nurse and John Proctor could be executed, who was safe? Ministers preached harder than ever about the devil's assault on their community, warning that even the highest born could be his servants. Fear had lost its boundaries. The hangings that followed reflected the new scope of the net. On August 19th, George Burroughs, John Proctor, George Jacobs Sr., John Willard, and Martha Carrier were executed together. Burroughs, moments before his death, prayed aloud, and not just any prayer. He recited the Lord's Prayer perfectly, without hesitation or error. In Puritan belief, this was an act no witch could accomplish. The crowd stirred uneasily. Murmurs rippled through the air. Could the court be wrong? But Chief Justice William Stoughton silenced the doubt, reminding everyone that the devil could mimic even the most holy acts. The drop came, and the murmurs died with Burroughs. For many, that day marked a turning point. It was one thing to hang the fringes of society, the misfits, the voiceless. It was another to execute men who had once led them in worship. The unease could not be entirely buried. Still, the machine ground on. In the court's mind, the widening of the net was proof of its necessity. The devil would target the strong as well as the weak, the learned as well as the simple. If anything, the prominence of the accused was seen as evidence of just how deep the corruption ran. In taverns, in fields, in whispered conversations behind closed doors, the people of Salem began to weigh their words more carefully. A careless comment about the trials could turn into a testimony against you. Neighbors who had once shared meals now crossed the street to avoid each other. Trust, the invisible fabric that held the town together, had begun to rot, and in the jail, those awaiting their fate heard the muffled sounds of carpenters outside, building new gallows beams. The work never stopped. When the next executions were scheduled, they included figures Salem had once thought untouchable, and among them was a man who would not plead guilty, no matter the cost. His name was Giles Corey. Some die by the rope, others by the weight of the earth itself. By September 1692, the gallows at Salem had become a familiar silhouette on the horizon, stark against the late summer sky, its beams weathered by the salt air drifting from the Atlantic. Most of the condemned had met their fate dangling from that wooden frame, the rope jerking once, then falling still. But for Giles Corey, the court had chosen something different, something older, darker, and far crueler. Giles was no stranger to the sharp edge of Salem's suspicion. At 81 years old, he was a stubborn, stone-faced man, a farmer with a reputation for blunt speech and an unwillingness to bow to anyone's authority. He had already felt the sting of scandal years before, accused of beating a farmhand to death. Though he escaped with only a fine, the shadow of that case never fully left him. Still, he was a respected landowner, his property sprawling in a village where every acre mattered. When his wife, Martha Corey, was accused of witchcraft earlier that year, Giles had spoken out in her defense. That alone was enough to make the court turn its gaze toward him. In Salem's fevered climate, to defend the accused was to stand with the devil. Soon, Giles found his own name written in the indictments. The trial began in September. The judges' faces grim under their wide-brimmed hats demanded that Giles enter a plea, guilty or not guilty. But Giles refused to say either. It was not stubbornness for its own sake. In colonial law, a conviction could mean the confiscation of his property. If he died without entering a plea, his land could not be legally seized by the colony. It would pass to his children, beyond the court's grasp. In silence, Giles had found his final act of defiance. The law had an answer for silence. It was an ancient English punishment, rarely used in the colonies, peine forte et dure, strong and hard pain. The accused would be pressed beneath heavy stones until they either entered a plea or died. On the morning of September 19th, the townsfolk gathered in a field on the edge of Salem. There was no gallows here, no rope swaying in the wind, only a rough patch of ground, a few boards laid out, and piles of heavy, flat stones brought from the surrounding fields. Giles was led to the spot, his body already weakened from months in jail. Witnesses would later recall that he did not weep, did not beg, did not curse. The sheriff, George Corwin, ordered him to lie flat on his back. A board was placed over his chest. Then came the first stone. It landed with a dull, crushing thud. Giles let out a grunt, not of pain, but of effort, as though refusing to give them the satisfaction of a cry. "Will you enter a plea?" the sheriff asked. Giles's voice, hoarse but steady, replied with two words that would echo in Salem's memory for centuries. "More weight." The crowd murmured. Some turned away, unable to watch. Others, hardened by months of accusations and executions, stared with grim fascination. Another stone was brought, then another. The board creaked under the growing load. Giles' chest rose and fell, in short, sharp bursts. Hours passed. The sheriff repeated his question. Again, Giles gave the same answer. More weight. It was defiance made into a death sentence. By the third hour, blood was seeping from his mouth. His eyes were half closed, but he remained conscious. Witnesses said that at one point he turned his head slightly to spit in the direction of the sheriff. Whether it was an act of contempt or simply the weakness of his failing body, none could say, but in the minds of those who saw it, Giles Corey died as he had lived, unbent. The pressing continued into the afternoon. The weight on his chest was now immense. Every breath was a battle, every heartbeat a smaller defiance against the stones pressing the life from him. The crowd had grown quieter. Even the judges looked uneasy. But the sheriff by law could not stop unless Giles spoke. He never did. By sunset, Giles Corey lay still beneath the stones. His ribs were shattered. His tongue had swollen and protruded from his mouth. The boards were lifted, the stones rolled away, and his body, bruised, broken, and bloodied, was carried back to the jail yard. No prayer was said over him. No funeral bell rang. The court had made an example of him, but in doing so, they had also made a martyr. In refusing to plead, Giles had ensured that his land would pass to his heirs, untouched by the colony's greedy hand. He had died under the law's cruelty, but he had beaten the court at its own game. That night, the story spread through Salem like wildfire. In taverns, behind locked doors, in hushed voices, people spoke of the old man who had refused to bow. "More weight," they repeated, the words becoming both curse and anthem. For the first time, doubt began to take root, not just in whispers, but in the minds of those who had cheered the hangings. The next executions were already scheduled, but Giles Corey's death had shifted something. The court's appetite was beginning to wane, not because they had found enough witches, but because they had finally made the mistake of killing a man the people admired. And soon, they would take a woman to the gallows who had been nothing less than a pillar of their community. Her name was Elizabeth Proctor. When fear becomes law, no one is safe. The death of Giles Corey did not stop the machinery of Salem's trials. If anything, It showed how far the court was willing to go. In the weeks that followed, the town's air seemed thicker, heavier, as though the invisible hand of suspicion pressed on every shoulder. It was not just the accused who felt the weight, it was everyone. Neighbors stopped speaking in the streets. Doors that had once stood open in summer now stayed bolted. Even the church pews, once filled with a communal warmth, seemed to hold people apart rather than bring them together. Every glance was measured, every word weighed before it was spoken. In Salem, a single wrong phrase could be enough to have you hauled before the magistrates. The minister's sermons only deepened the terror. Reverend Samuel Parris, whose own household had birthed the first afflicted girls, thundered from the pulpit about the devil's relentless siege. His voice rose over the wooden rafters, warning of unseen covens meeting in the forests, of witches walking the streets disguised as neighbors. Children were told to stay indoors after sunset. Men carried muskets when tending their fields, though none could say what good a musket might do against a spectral enemy. And yet there were whispers that the devil's reach had spread beyond the poor, the misfits, and the outcast. He was said now to be working through the respected, the wealthy, and the pious. That was when fear began to fracture the town completely. In July, the name of Rebecca Nurse had been read aloud in court, and the shock was immediate. Rebecca was no beggar, no drifter. She was a 71-year-old grandmother, known for her kindness, her charity, her steady faith. If a woman like Rebecca could be accused, then no one, no matter their station, was safe. Elizabeth Proctor's name soon followed. Her family was prosperous, her household orderly, but her husband, John Proctor, had been openly critical of the trials. In Salem, opposition was a dangerous stance. The afflicted girls claimed Elizabeth's spectre had tormented them, pricking their skin with pins in the dead of night. When the court summoned her, the Proctor farm fell silent, the clatter of work replaced by the creak of a wagon carrying her away. This was the new reality of Salem. Fear no longer moved from the bottom of society upward. It now flowed in every direction, like a tide swallowing the shore. Wealth, reputation, piety, these were no longer shields. Inside the jail, the accused languished in squalor. The smell of unwashed bodies clung to the damp air. Rats skittered along the straw, shackles chafed ankles raw. Outside, life in the village became an elaborate act of self-preservation. People avoided old friends if they had even the faintest connection to the accused. Marriages strained. Land disputes, old grudges, and petty rivalries were suddenly sharpened into weapons, all under the banner of protecting the town from witchcraft. Property belonging to the condemned was quickly seized, sometimes legally, often not. Neighbors moved livestock from one pasture to another under cover of night, claiming the devil's mark as justification. It was a convenient truth. To name someone a witch was to open a path to their land, their goods, their livelihood. The afflicted girls continued their performances in court, their screams and convulsions as dramatic as ever. They clutched at their throats, fell to the floor, and pointed trembling fingers at the accused. And the judges, still enthralled by their testimony, gave these outbursts the full weight of law. For many, attending the trials had become a grim form of entertainment. Spectators crowded the court, straining to hear each new accusation. But beneath the thrill ran something colder, the creeping realization that the spectacle could turn on anyone without warning. Giles Corey's death had planted doubt, but doubt was dangerous to voice. The few who dared to question the court risked joining the ranks of the accused themselves. Even whispers of dissent could be turned into evidence of witchcraft. The turning point, though few recognized it at the time, came when the name of Mary Easty was called. Mary was Rebecca Nurse's sister, respected and well-liked. She carried herself with quiet dignity, even as she was brought in chains. When she was condemned, her final petition to the court asked not for her own life, but for an end to the trials, so that no more innocent blood be shed. Her words spread quietly through the town, repeated in kitchens and whispered in fields. The noose still tightened around Salem, but the rope had begun to fray. Still, in the final weeks of summer, the fear was at its peak. The harvest went untended in many fields. Children were left half-fed while their parents attended the trials. Marriages were broken by the strain of divided loyalties. Some fled the town entirely, abandoning homes rather than risk the gallows. And then, in September, the court prepared for the execution of Elizabeth Proctor. Her husband had already been convicted. The town braced for yet another rope to swing over the gallows hill, but Elizabeth carried a secret that would delay her fate, and, in its delay, would help unravel the court's grip on Salem. It is easy to summon the gallows, harder to send them away. Elizabeth Proctor stood before the court, the air thick with the smell of sweat and tallow from the candles that burned along the walls. She had been condemned, her name carved into the roster of the doomed, but when the magistrates asked if she had anything to say before the sentence was carried out, she revealed something unexpected. She was with child. A murmur rippled through the crowded chamber. Even the most fervent believers in the court's justice knew that to hang a pregnant woman would be to kill an innocent life. By Puritan law, Elizabeth's execution would be postponed until after the birth. It was a reprieve, but only for her. Dozens of others remained on the schedule for the noose. Still, her announcement planted a seed of hesitation. It reminded the town that these trials were not only ending lives, but altering futures, breaking families in ways that could not be mended. Governor William Phips returned to Massachusetts from the war in Maine that September to find the colony in chaos. The executions had become the colony's most urgent business, overshadowing trade, defense, and diplomacy. He had lost friends to the rope. Letters had reached him from Boston, ministers urging caution, their words wrapped in respectful but urgent concern. The court was moving too quickly, condemning too easily. Then came the blow from the Mather's Increase Mather, the influential minister and president of Harvard College, and his son Cotton Mather, whose writings on witchcraft had helped fuel the hysteria. Increase's pamphlet, Cases of Conscience Concerning Evil Spirits, landed like a stone in the still water of public opinion. In it, he warned, "It is better that 10 suspected witches escape than that one innocent person be condemned." It was a careful sentence, neither a full rebuke nor an endorsement of the trials, but it gave those who doubted the court a shield. If the Mathers could say it, others could echo it. Phips saw the tide shifting. He had the authority to dissolve the special court of Oyer and Terminer, and in late October, that is exactly what he did. Trials for witchcraft would still occur, but under a new court with stricter standards for evidence. Spectral evidence, the claim that a person's spirit or shape had appeared to harm someone, would no longer be enough for a conviction. Without that tool, the cases began to crumble. Accusers could scream and faint, but without the court accepting their visions as proof, the charges felt less certain. Juries hesitated. Some defendants were acquitted outright. For those still awaiting trial, hope flickered cautiously. Yet for the families of the dead, the governor's changes came too late. 19 had been hanged, and Giles Corey pressed to death before doubt found its footing. In the cold light of winter, the frenzy slowed further. The afflicted girls appeared in court less often. Their seizures became rarer. The ministers shifted their sermons away from witchcraft and back towards sin and salvation in the more general sense, and yet there was no official apology, no public reckoning. The machinery had simply stopped, leaving its victims buried without ceremony. Some of the accusers slipped quietly back into ordinary life. Others married, moved away, and tried to erase the memory. But not all were willing to let the story fade. In the years that followed, several of the girls, now women, confessed that they had lied or had been misled by the devil into making false accusations. Anne Putnam Jr., one of the most vocal accusers, stood before her congregation in 1706 and asked forgiveness for her role in the deaths. She named specifically Rebecca Nurse and her sister Mary Easty, saying she had been deluded and blinded by Satan. The congregation forgave her, at least in word. By then, Massachusetts had offered compensation to some of the families of the condemned money, land, or public acknowledgement of wrongful execution. But these gestures could not restore a lost husband, wife, or child. They could not scrub the memory of the gallows from the minds of those who had watched the ropes swing. For Salem, the damage was permanent. Trust between neighbors had been shattered. Property lines had been redrawn in the wake of the accusations. Fortunes gained and lost under the pretense of piety. and the name of the town itself had become shorthand for injustice, whispered far beyond Massachusetts Bay. The last official prisoner accused of witchcraft was released in 1693, when Phipps ordered a general pardon. But the gallows hill remained a scar on the land where wind still moved through the grass in uneasy silence. The trials had ended, but the fear had not entirely gone. For decades, faint rumours persisted of charms buried in fields, of sudden illnesses blamed on the evil eye, of shadows moving where no one walked. In private, some still wondered if they had been right to stop. And perhaps that was the darkest truth of all, that the collapse of the court was not the product of a full awakening, but of exhaustion. Salem had simply grown tired of the hangings. The questions of guilt and innocence were left, like so many graves, unanswered. In the quiet that followed, Salem tried to return to its rhythms. The market square filled again with merchants. Ships came and went from the harbour. Fields were tilled and planted. But beneath the surface, the memory of 1692 lingered, a wound beneath the skin, invisible but unhealed. And in the shadows of that year, the names of the dead Bridget Bishop, Rebecca Nurse, John Proctor, Giles Corey, and so many others would whisper against the walls of Salem for generations. The gallows had fallen silent, but history had not finished speaking. The hangman's rope may rot, but the mark it leaves does not fade. Winter settled over Salem like a heavy quilt, muffling the footsteps on its frozen lanes. Snow gathered in the hollows of Gallows Hill, burying the raw earth where the bodies of the condemned had fallen. The wind off the Atlantic still carried salt and cold, but now it also carried whispers. The trials were over. The gallows stood empty. But in the minds of Salem's people, the ropes still swayed. The physical aftermath was immediate and visible. Homes once filled with laughter stood silent, their owners gone to prison or the grave. Farmlands lay untended, the fences broken, livestock sold off to pay legal fees. The trials had not only taken lives, they had fractured the town's economic backbone. Merchants who once traded freely now eyed each other with suspicion, wondering who had testified against whom. Some of the accused returned to their homes, carrying scars far deeper than the winter frost. They were not celebrated as survivors. Instead, they were avoided, as though the shadow of accusation clung to them like a contagion. Children crossed the road to avoid their doorsteps. Church pews subtly shifted so they sat alone. The families of the executed fared no better. In Puritan society, honour was a currency, and theirs had been spent in the court's ledger of sin. Land that had been seized during the trials rarely returned to its rightful owners. Neighbours who had enriched themselves through accusation found reasons to keep what they had taken. And then there were the accusers. A handful left Salem entirely, hoping distance could silence memory. Others stayed, attempting to slip back into the routines of daily life. But in a town where every face was familiar, that was not so easily done. Even in the market square, where the calls of fishmongers and the smell of baking bread should have drowned out the past, glances lingered just a little too long. The ministers, too, faced their own reckoning. Reverend Samuel Parris, in whose household the first fits had begun, clung stubbornly to his post, defending his role in the trials. But as the years passed, his congregation's resentment grew. In 1697, under mounting pressure, he was forced to resign. He left Salem, his name forever bound to the witchcraft panic. Yet perhaps the most haunting aftermath was internal, the slow, private realization among many that they had been wrong. It was one thing to suspect that the devil had walked in Salem. It was another to accept that human fear and ambition had done most of the devil's work. Some confession came quickly. Just 5 years after the trials, Samuel Sewell, one of the judges, stood before the congregation at Boston's Old South Church and publicly confessed his guilt. He declared a day of fasting and prayer, asking God to pardon his role in condemning the innocent. The moment was shocking, a public official humbling himself in the house of God, but it was also singular. Most others who had sat in judgment offered no such repentance. It was not until 1711, nearly 2 decades later, that the Massachusetts legislature passed an act reversing the convictions of some of the victims and granting financial compensation to their heirs. Even then, the gesture was incomplete. Some names were left off the list, some families refused the money, seeing it as blood-stained coin. In 1706, Anne Putnam Jr., one of the most fervent young accusers, stood before her congregation and read a confession of sorts. Her voice trembled as she admitted she had been misled by the devil and blinded by her own errors. She named Rebecca Nurse, Mary Easty, and others, asking forgiveness for her false charges. The words were written in the language of Puritan piety, but beneath them lay the unmistakable weight of regret. Whether her admission brought any peace to the families she had harmed is harder to say. Still, for most, the past remained a private burden. There were no grand ceremonies to mark the end of the hysteria, no sermons preached in honor of the dead. Salem's people simply returned to the business of surviving, planting crops, mending nets, raising children. But the silence spoke loudly. Even as the decades passed, the land itself seemed unwilling to forget. Locals avoided Gallows Hill after dark, claiming the wind there carried faint voices. Some swore they had heard the creak of rope in the night air, or seen shapes swaying just beyond the reach of lantern light. Whether these were the tricks of the mind or something older and stranger, no one could say. Beyond Salem, the trials became both warning and weapon. In Boston and other colonies, ministers used the story as a cautionary tale against the dangers of false witness and the misuse of spiritual authority. In political disputes, rivals hurled the word Salem like an accusation of its own, shorthand for reckless persecution. And yet, not all lessons were learned. Witchcraft accusations would rise again in other parts of the New World and in Europe. Fear, it seemed, could always find new soil. By the mid-18th century, the events of 1692 had already begun to pass from living memory into history, but the records remained court transcripts, ministerial sermons, private letters. These documents preserved the exact words of the accusers, the condemned, and the judges. They left no room to claim that it had all been rumor or myth. The truth in its chilling detail was there for anyone who cared to read it. In time, the trials became part of Salem's identity, a past both disowned and inescapable. Generations later, the town would lean into its reputation, drawing visitors curious to walk its haunted streets. But in the immediate aftermath, there was no hint of the tourism to come, only a small, tight-knit community trying and failing to put the horror behind them. The Salem of the years after the trials was not the same town that had entered 1692. Trust had been stripped away, neighbor turned against neighbor, faith used as a weapon, and though the fields grew green again and ships once more filled the harbor, something essential had been lost. The shadow of the gallows lay long over the land, and it would not lift for centuries. The truth of Salem is like smoke. It twists, it fades, and it refuses to be held. In the centuries since 1692, historians, scientists, and psychologists have all tried to prise apart the knots of fear and faith that bound Salem into its frenzy. The records are rich trial transcripts, ministerial notes, petitions, confessions, but they are not enough to give us certainty. And perhaps that is the most haunting part. We can never fully know why the town turned on itself. Still, there are theories, and each one is a key unlocking not the whole door, but part of it. The most famous explanation is one that smells faintly of the fields: ergot poisoning. Ergot is a fungus that grows on rye, turning the grain into a host for a potent hallucinogen, the same chemical base later used to create LSD. In warm, damp conditions it thrives. Ingested, it can cause convulsions, hallucinations, burning sensations in the limbs, and a creeping sense of doom. To those who lived in the 17th century, such symptoms might have looked like the devil's grip. In 1976, a researcher named Linda Caporiel proposed that the fits of the afflicted girls matched ergotism's effects. The summer before the trials, Salem had suffered from heavy rains, followed by a mild winter, ideal conditions for ergot growth. Rye bread was the town's staple. The idea fit neatly. The poison in the bread could explain the twisting bodies, the visions, the voices. But Ergot's logic frays under scrutiny. If the rye was poisoned, why did symptoms affect certain people and not others in the same households? Why did the afflictions spread in a way that followed social lines more than dietary ones? And ergotism is rare in that it attacks the body relentlessly. Those who suffer it don't recover and relapse at will, as many of Salem's afflicted did. Another theory, older than the ergot one, lives in the realm of the mind: mass hysteria. Today, we call it mass psychogenic illness, the spread of illness symptoms without a physical cause, born instead from stress, fear, and suggestion. In small, tightly knit communities, such events are not rare. The human mind is a fertile field for contagion, and in 1692, Salem's soil was rich with anxiety. Fear of Indian attacks, disputes over land, religious tension, and recent memories of plague and famine. The afflicted, most of them young girls, were under intense social and religious pressures. In Puritan New England, obedience was the highest virtue. Girls were to be silent in church, silent in family disputes, silent in public life. But in the trials, the afflicted were given center stage. Their words carried weight enough to kill. In that spotlight, the fits might have been both an unconscious cry for power and a shield from punishment. Yet mass hysteria explains only the beginning. It does not fully account for the way Salem's leaders embraced the accusations, or why the trials spiraled so far beyond the circle of afflicted girls. For that, another theory steps in, one rooted not in fungus or fever, but in politics and power. Salem was not a single unified community. It was two: Salem town, the bustling port, and Salem village, the poorer farming settlement. The two clashed over taxes, church appointments, and who should control the land. The witchcraft accusations often fell along these lines, with villagers targeting town merchants and vice versa. In such an environment, an accusation could be a weapon. It could remove a rival, seize land, or settle an old grudge under the righteous banner of rooting out the devil. This is where we must speak of spectral evidence, the court's willingness to accept dreams, visions, and invisible assaults as proof. It was a dangerous shift. It meant that no defense was possible, for how could one disprove another's dream? This was not unique to Salem. English witch trials had allowed it before, but in Salem, it became the court's central pillar. Some historians see this as deliberate manipulation. The leaders of the court, already under pressure from the colony's political instability, Massachusetts had only just regained its charter from England, may have seen the witch trials as a way to unite the people in a single cause, distracting from political fractures. In this reading, the hysteria was real, but it was also cultivated. Then there is religion, the Puritan faith, that framed the world as a battlefield between God and Satan. In this worldview, the devil was not a metaphor. He was a living, scheming enemy, walking among the people, whispering in their ears, tempting them to sin. And his servants, witches, could look exactly like your neighbor, your friend, even your own wife or child. To a people who believed their colony was a city upon a hill, a model of godliness for the world, the thought that Satan had infiltrated their ranks was almost unbearable. But not all theories focus on the accusers. Some look at the accused. Many of those named were women who lived outside the norm's outspoken widows, healers who used folk remedies, women who owned property in their own right. In a rigidly patriarchal society, such independence could be seen as a threat. Witchcraft accusations, then, might have been a way to enforce social conformity, a warning to other women not to step too far outside the lines. And there are stranger theories, still whispers of vengeance from beyond Salem's borders. Some point to the recent war with the Wabanaki people, allied with the French, as a source of trauma. Refugees from frontier villages, some of whom had seen family members killed in raids, had fled to Salem and nearby towns. They carried tales of violence, sorcery, and spiritual warfare. Could such stories, told by the fireside on winter nights, have planted seeds in the minds of Salem's people, seeds that would sprout into visions of witches in their midst? No single theory can explain it all, Perhaps the truth is a tangled rope of many strands: ergot's poison, hysteria's contagion, politics' manipulation, religion's fire. What we know is this: the Salem Witch Trials were not a simple case of superstition run wild. They were the product of a society under immense strain, where fear could override justice, where personal grudges could wear the mask of piety, and where the invisible could be made more real than the visible. And maybe that is why Salem still chills us. Because while the gallows are gone and the laws have changed, the conditions that allowed 1,692 to happen are not locked in the past. Fear, ambition, and belief, those forces are timeless, which leaves one last question, one that will never have a certain answer. Did anyone in Salem truly believe they saw witches, or did they simply believe it was safer to say so? The ropes are gone, but the air still remembers. Outside Salem, on a low hill once bare of trees, the grass moves gently in the wind. The gallows is long vanished, torn down, its timbers scattered, but the earth beneath still feels heavy, as though it remembers the weight it bore. In 1,692, this ground was not silent. It heard the shuffle of bound feet, the murmured prayers, the thud of boots on the wooden steps. It heard the crowd murmur when the trapdoor fell and the rope groaned under the drop. It heard the silence that followed, a silence sharper than any cry. Now, the hill is quiet, the air is clean, the sky wide. But if you stand there at dusk, when the sun has just slipped below the tree line, you might feel a strange unease, as though the ground itself is watching you. Down in the town, Salem's streets are paved and busy. Shops sell bread, coffee, trinkets for tourists. The name of the town is printed on mugs, stitched on hats, turned into a marketable shadow of the horror that once lived here. But between the bricks, the cracks remain. In the churchyard, the stones are worn and lichen-covered. Names carved deep in the 17th century are almost gone, as if the earth is trying to swallow them. You might pass them without a glance unless you know. Unless you understand that some of these names are those who were hanged, others those who watched, others those who accused. All of them are part of the same story. The echoes here are not only in the ground, but in us. In every time a community has turned on itself, in every moment when fear has been louder than reason, in every place where the innocent have been condemned because silence was safer than truth. Salem's gallows no longer stand, but their shadow has no need of wood. It lives in the choices we make, in the ease with which we believe what we are told, in the quickness with which we look for someone to blame. As the night folds over the town, the wind picks up across the hill. It moves through the grass, the same grass that grew from the soil fed by the dead of 1,692. The sound is soft, almost like a whisper, almost like the murmur of a name, and then it fades, until nothing remains but the quiet. Because history has forgotten many things, but the stones remember.